Hi, I'm Saida Garrett, co-writer of Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror, and you're listening to Rainbow Country with Mr. Mark Tara.
The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the persons appearing on the program.
Today on Rainbow Country, queer activist, author, and researcher Gary Kinsman is my guest and joins me to talk about the third edition of his 1987 book, The Regulation of Desire, Queer Histories, Queer Struggles. That and more in episode 415, so stay tuned for Gay Talk Radio right here on Rainbow Country.
Hi, this is Emily Saliers from Indigo Girls.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Harder, porn star, burlesque performer, and the creator of Porn to Be a Star. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Hello and welcome to a brand new journey through Rainbow Country, as I like to call it, a little gay radio show working to give voice to the LGBT community and beyond. And as always, I am your tour guide through Rainbow Country. I'm producer and host, Mark Tara. By the way, Rainbow Country originates from CIUT FM in Toronto, and now proudly in syndication on 12 outlets across Canada, from coast to coast to coast. The Yukon, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the east coast of Canada in Newfoundland, Ontario, even down to Buffalo, New York, and online. Well, thanks to you tuning in, streaming, downloading, but ultimately listening. Together, we continue to build Rainbow Country into a nationally syndicated gay radio show, a #1 LGBT podcast on Podomatic.com's Gay and Lesbian chart, as well as being recognized as a #1 Canadian LGBT podcast on Feedspot.com. So today, retired Canadian professor of sociology focusing on LGBT issues, queer activist, author, and researcher Gary Kinsman joins me to talk about the third edition of his 1987 book, The Regulation of Desire, Queer Histories, Queer Struggles, a book that talks about the rise of the neoliberal queer and the mainstreaming of white defined homosexuality. Plus, in hour 2, music from LGBT artists, independent artists, voices that we've come to know and love in classic disco, classic 80s, classic house, and on this episode I'm featuring some classic 80s, a spotlight on gender non-binary artist Angel Baribeau, and more. All that lies ahead as we start Journey 415 through Rainbow Country. Our first stop, the Rainbow Country Bookstore. Today, actor, author, and erotic provocateur David Pesner reads from his memoir, Damn Shame, a book about desire, defiance, and show tunes. By the way, Damn Shame on Amazon.ca has a rating of 4.4 out of 5 stars.
We had drinks in his room a few more times, and each time I loosened up enough, first to let him kiss me, I think I passed out for a second, then to make out, eventually with tongues, but he knew I wasn't ready to push things forward. Though I was insane with desire whenever our lips touched, I would resist his advances when it got too involved. What I put him through. Jesus. After a week after my first 7-and-7 encounter with Stan, after I got particularly plowed by the alcohol, not him, we took a walk into Shenley Park. It was a frozen evening and we were both bundled up in winter coats, sweaters, shirts, hats, scarves, layer upon layer. It was too cold for anyone to be out, but we found a spot to sit away from the wind. And as we talked, we inched closer and closer until our bodies were hugging, entwined, a mass of woolly layers and horny boys. I felt his hand start to wander, and I sat, a bundle of tension, as he worked that hand in an almost comical journey through that mass, first unzipping my coat, just enough to get his hand on my thick cable knit sweater, which he lifted up so that he could get through to the button-down shirt, undoing 3 buttons to get through to the t-shirt underneath, which he gently tugged out of my pants, and the shock of his cold hand touching my naked flesh made me shake with a need I didn't even know I had. And I kept taking in little short bursts of air as if I was on a funhouse ride that I couldn't get off if I tried. None of my skin was exposed to the elements. I was still buried in warm layers against the cold dryness of the evening, and he just kept burrowing deeper and deeper and lower, and I thought I was going to die, just die, as he began finagling open my belt so that he could undo the clasp of my pants to get to the zipper, lowering it with care, pushing away the sides of the open fly, gently rubbing his palm up and down the bulge of my hanes until he pulled down the waistband and let his index finger barely graze the tip of my rock-hard cock. And the instant he made contact, boom, my body exploded from within, and I shot and shot and shot and shot and shot, and he held me close. And I whimpered and cried and felt his hand pull away, slowly retracting back through the maze so that he could wrap his arms around me and just let me be in the ecstasy, emotion of the moment. When the storm passed, we barely said a word as I hitched up my pants and got myself presentable. And he took my hand, and we walked back to our respective dorms in total silence. When I got back to my room, I looked for any signs that it had happened, but I could find no dried jizz, nothing from what felt like gallons of cum shooting out of me on any of the layers of clothing. It was the immaculate ejaculation. In 1984, when Vanessa Williams' Penthouse photos were published and she got stripped of the Miss America crown, I was all up in arms, furious. I heard she was giving a press conference at the Sheraton Center Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, and I had to be there. I don't remember her denying, decrying, or apologizing for the posing she had done. The photos were pretty explicit. She wasn't having intercourse, but she was naked with another woman and, horrors, giving and receiving tongue in places society frowned upon with someone of the same sex. In making sure my memory served me correctly, I Googled the whole situation, and it turns out she was quoted as saying she regretted doing it, that young people do stupid things. However, she also said she had not committed an act of, quote, moral turpitude. So at least she didn't back away and say it was disgusting and awful, and she did not apologize. She said if the pageant wanted to take away her crown, which they did, so be it. She focused more on the legality of posting photos when she was promised they would never get out. She handled it well, and I believe the fact that she addressed everything head on without apology is why she continues to have a successful career, and this did not ruin her. Today, it seems that whenever a celebrity has nude pics leaked on the internet, it's a huge deal, gigantic, an incredible violation of privacy, a travesty, a crime, an emotional nightmare. I contend that, though it may be exciting for the viewer to see a celebrity in the all-together or copulating, maybe for the subject of the photos, it ain't such a big deal. Once it's out there, why are they so concerned that America, the world, is watching them naked, hard, having sex, whatever? My take is the Vanessa Williams rule. Own it. Don't apologize. Do not say the words, I'm sorry. Say, yep, that's me. I look pretty good, don't I? And if you own it, I believe they cannot come for you. My friend Steve, who worked in high-profile public relations for years, says the cardinal rule in his business is always take control of your own story. Prime advice. It's when you cower and apologize and put yourself on their level of screwed-up morality that you get in trouble. And as I earlier noted, that screwed-up morality was coming at us fast and furious, and I was done with it. I was hitting bars, bathhouses, and sex clubs, and even with the beard, I was wearing. I was getting to fuck around with the kind of guys I so desired when I was skinny and no one paid attention to me. That book of lust was getting a real workout. Name after name entered and recorded for history in that book. Robbie, Lance, Jamal, and Vince. Boy, was he high maintenance. William, Jerry, Sam, and Mick. Rocky, Douglas, Dick. Oh, Dick. He wasn't Richard. He was Dick. That thing was big and really thick. He schlepped out what he had in store. It hung 6 inches from the floor. Erect, think of a baseball bat. And then imagine 3 times that. We spent our nights together trying hard to make it fit. After our 3rd date, I couldn't walk, I couldn't sit. And then misfortune ran amok, a horrifying moment, a catastrophe, the final straw. He thrust and oops, he broke my jaw. Larry, Barry, Gary, Dave, all his pubic hair he'd shave. Isai, Juan, and 2 Jose's. That was in my Latin phase. Jordan, Colin, Dirk, and Hunts. Sue, I had to try it once. Famous movie heartthrob. Who? Sorry, but I can't tell you. But the year he won his Golden Globe, I met him backstage in his robe. He shook my hand without disguise. The terry cloth began to rise. He licked his lips. The next thing, boom, I'm on the couch in his dressing room. He became my bottom boy, and I was his top gun. It was risky, just impossible, but really lots of fun. I signed a contract to agree to confidentiality. I say his name, I go to jail, but I swear it's not an old cocktail. From the Book of Lust. Relax, those last 2 stanzas are a fantasy. Don't go sicken the lawyers on me.
Glad Day Bookshop started in Gerald Moldenhauer's backpack around 1972. Gerald figured that to build community we needed access to our history, our culture, our literature, our porn. He started schlepping books and magazines from one queer event to another to sell. As the collection got bigger, he moved it to a hall in the commune where he lived, in an old house on Seton Street in downtown Toronto. In those days, to see the books, you needed to phone first to make an appointment to come over. Glad Day finally opened a fully fledged store in the late 1970s, and that's when the more public profiles started causing problems. An issue with the Canadian book business is that a lot of titles are published elsewhere and therefore need to be imported, and that means they all have to pass through Canada Customs. And Canada Customs in those days was not about to let dirty, smutty, queer literature cross the border to corrupt innocent Canadians. Glad Day started having books seized and shipments blocked starting in 1977. It got worse in the 80s. Even The Joy of Gay Sex got banned as obscene. And even if books got through customs, they were still not safe. In April 82, police raided Glad Day and charged employee Kevin Orr with selling obscene material. And that wouldn't be the last raid. Glad Day was embroiled in court cases for years. Some American publications actually started producing special Canadian editions with pages blanked out to get them across the border. In 1983, partners Bruce Smythe and Jim Deva started a gay bookstore in Vancouver called Little Sisters. Little Sisters was soon experiencing customs seizures as well. What was infuriating was that big mainstream bookstores were now importing and selling many of the same titles without a problem. It was just small, gay-run bookstores that were being targeted. Little Sisters also fought the customs seizures through the courts, but it took years and thousands of dollars before the Supreme Court finally decided that the seizures were a violation of the Charter of Rights. That was in 2000. Customs still had the right to stop materials, but the onus was on them to prove they were obscene. Customs censorship finally began to grind to a halt. By this time, queer material was widely available, and the digital age meant that borders were being largely irrelevant anyway. But today, both Glad Day and Little Sisters continue to operate as bookstores. Glad Day is actually the oldest surviving gay bookstore in the world. So if you are in Toronto or Vancouver, be sure to check them out. They're part of the living history of our community. This is Tim McCaskill, author of Queer Progress.
When I return, queer histories, queer struggles.
Hi, everybody. This is Gino Vanelli. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Gary Kinsman, hi, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good, thank you.
I have to say, thank you for being here, to have your voice, your story be heard by the LGBT community and beyond. So thank you for this, especially to talk about the regulation of desire, queer histories, queer struggles. I believe this book is, over 400 pages? It's the third edition. Generally speaking, what are some of the topics that you're writing about within the pages of the regulation of desire? Talk to me about some of the topics that you're talking about in this book.
For sure. First of all, it's a third edition, so the first edition came out in 1987.
87?
A long time ago. Yeah, 1987, a long time ago. A lot since then. The second edition came out in 1996. So there's still an awful lot that's happened since 1996. So I think the first thing for people to sort of know about the third edition is that I think it's a pretty, it's rather idiosyncratic, but a pretty accurate update of what has significantly happened since 1996. So a critical analysis of the same marriage campaign, a critical analysis of the apology from the federal government, critical analysis of the emergence of the sort of new right-wing anti-trans, anti-queer organizing that's going on, the emergence of what I describe as the sort of white neoliberal queer, which is often the layer of people that's at the top of our communities. I could go into all of those in more detail, but those are some of the things that are really sort of vital and important about the book. I've also updated things. So, for instance, the chapter on Indigenous struggles and Indigenous knowledge has been reworked and rewritten because it was really inadequate, looking back on it now in terms of 1987 and 1996. A whole bunch of new information is included. And again, an awful lot's happened since 1996.
So you just mentioned 2024. This is the third edition, 1996, the second edition. You just mentioned 1987 was when the book was first published. Is the regulation of desire in 2024, is this the same book, essentially, that was originally published in 1987? Or is this a whole new book, essentially?
Yeah, I would actually have to say that it's not the book that was published in 1987. I mean, there's still some of the text from that is included in the book. In terms of the 1996 edition, a revised version of the second edition is included in the third edition, which is why it's a relatively huge or large book, because it's got both new information and the information that was there in 1996. So it certainly is in continuity with the 1996 edition, but it is much more expanded and revised. There's certain things that I am now critical of that were published in the first and second editions. I'll just give you one example. I think I helped to perpetuate the notion that what happened in 1969 was actually that the so-called partial decriminalization of homosexuality. And I've learned since that time, since 1996, that is a completely inadequate account of what actually took place in 1969. It wasn't actually the partial decriminalization of homosexuality. It was only of two criminal code offenses. They weren't actually decriminalized in their entirety at all. Anything that happened in the so-called broad public realm remained criminalized. Anything involving more than two people remained criminalized. and anything involving a person under the age of 21 remained criminalized. So I've sort of tried to correct that sort of perhaps misunderstanding that I conveyed in the first and second editions in this third edition with a sort of more critical approach to what took place in 1969 and also the anniversary of it that was marked or celebrated for some people in 2017.
What prompted you to want to revise this book in 2024? Was there a moment, was there a flashpoint that you said, the 1996 version, we need to update this? What sparked all of this?
Well, what sparked it was the developments that I found taking place, often disturbing developments from my vantage point as a longtime sort of left-wing queer liberation activist, who's also an AIDS activist, anti-racist activist, and more. I just felt increasingly alienated from, separated off from the way in which the mainstream of the LGBT movements and pride organizing in the larger urban centers really had become very commercialized, very commodified, very tied into various forms of government. So, for instance, one of the things that happened after 1996 was in Toronto, Queers Against Israeli Apartheid was basically banned and censored for a number of years because various funding agencies, various governments, various organizations did not want the word Israeli apartheid used in Pride Toronto. And unfortunately, Pride Toronto is continuing that type of practice coming into Pride season in 2024 when they have called for a ceasefire, but nothing more. And they're refusing to actually take up the call from queers in Palestine who have asked for a whole series of measures to be taken by queer and trans organizations around the world. 550 organizations have, but Pride Toronto and many of the mainstream organizations in so-called Canada have not. This is also one of the reasons why I just recently resigned as a member from Pride Toronto, because I cannot be part of a Pride celebration that is going on during genocide against queer, trans, and gender diverse people in Palestine and in Gaza, and now Rafah in particular. So those are a number of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, to provide a more critical perspective on what's been going on, especially with the emergence of what I just described as the white neoliberal queer. But I actually was asked by Concordia University Press to do this third edition. That's what sort of provoked it as an actual project I could engage in. I was engaged in other projects, including being the co-author of the Canadian War on Queers, National Security as Sexual Regulation with Patricia Gentile. So I was engaged in other projects, but when they approached me about doing this, I thought, this is the time when I can actually both update things, but also develop a more critical approach to some of the things that are unfortunately being too often taken for granted within our communities.
Okay. Those are some powerful words that you just mentioned. You also just mentioned the neoliberal queer. You write about this in the third edition. In basic terms, what is or what are neoliberal queers?
Yeah. So and that's a major topic of the book, and one of the reasons why people should want to look at it. But a brief description would be that neoliberalism is the strategy that various capitalist states, various political parties adopt following the revolts of the 1960s and early 1970s, which is also where gay liberation, lesbian feminism, and a whole bunch of social movements come from. And there's basically two approaches within it. One is a moral conservative form of neoliberalism, which attacks, queer and trans people directly. And it's unfortunately that's what's coming around again in terms of the emergence of the new anti-trans, anti-queer right wing. But there's also a sort of more, quote, liberal version of neoliberalism, which supports on a very limited scale rights for women, rights for lesbians and gay men, for some even rights for trans people. But it really only supports them for white middle-class people in our communities. And unfortunately, when our mass struggles die down, the people who often rise to the top in our communities are people who can speak the same language as those people who rule in government and corporations. And that has become the sort of new elite in our communities, a sort of white middle-class elite that sees that all we need to demand for our liberation and freedom is to be let into capitalist institutions, and that that's supposedly going to be how our liberation is brought about. What it forgets about is that all of the queer and trans and gender diverse people who experience oppression because they're Black, because they're Indigenous, because they're racialized, because they're unhoused, because they live in poverty, or because they might be working class but not at the higher levels of the working class. All of those people are basically left out of the type of rights revolution that has taken place within the Canadian state. For me, the most hopeful signs is that organizing among those people who've been left out and are demanding not only to be let back in, but they're actually demanding a different project. We really need to return to the radical roots. And by radical here, I mean getting to the roots of the problem, which is what radical really should mean. Getting to the roots of the problem in understanding where our movements actually came from. So, for instance, when the Gay Liberation Front emerges in New York City following the Stonewall riots against police repression, it's named after the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, which was at that point in time engaging in, armed struggle against U.S. imperialism and the U.S. military. The Gay Liberation Front initially tried to form alliances with the Black Panther Party. Black Panther Party members, Young Lords members, participated in the Stonewall riot. And what has happened is that once this sort of neoliberal history is put forward in our communities, we systematically are asked to forget about all of those connections, all of the sort of radical roots of where our movements came from. So, we don't remember that 1981 in Toronto, when I was part of the Lesbian and Gay Pride Day committee that had the first march in commemoration of the Stonewall rebellions, other pride events that occurred in Toronto before that, for sure, that was actually only able to exist because it was initiated by the group I was involved in at that point, called Gay Liberation Against the Right Everywhere. We were organizing against the moral conservative neoliberal right wing. And it was also in the context of the Bath raids in 1981, which led to a mass revolt. And it's only in that context that Pride actually emerges as a celebration, a commemoration of what was happening at the Stonewall riot. So there's people, unfortunately, within our communities who want us to forget those histories because they want us just to be accommodated and to accept the types of oppressive relations that exist in a capitalist society. My book, in some ways, is a weapon directed against that social organization of forgetting and a celebration of what I describe as the resistance of remembering. So it's really important.
When you say people want us to forget about things that have happened in the past, give me maybe one or two examples of what you're talking about in regards to wanting to forget certain things? Because from my understanding is, especially when it comes to gay pride, like gay pride in Canada, in Toronto, goes back to thing like the 70s and stuff, and there have been different iterations of it. And I guess for the record, they say it originally starts in 81, but that's not necessarily the whole history of it. So can you give me some examples of what you're talking about in terms of wanting to forget?
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple of examples. One is just the 1969 Criminal Code itself, which people in mainstream...
And you're talking about the Canadian Criminal Code, correct?
That's correct. What some people will refer to as the legalization of homosexuality or the decriminalization of homosexuality. It was neither. And I mean, it's really clear to understand that the number of people arrested by the police actually increase in quite great numbers after the 69 criminal code reform. The bath raids are actually mandated
a result of that
by the 1969 criminal code reform because the baths are seen as being supposedly in the public realm. So we're asked to think that Pierre Elliott Trudeau actually decriminalized or legalized homosexuality when that was not at all the case. Instead, we need to remember the resistance in the streets, the organizing of the Right to Privacy Committee, how so many of the men who were charged in the bath raids actually were acquitted. So that's just one example. Another one would be not remembering that our movements actually organized in alliance with the groups of people that we're interconnected with in terms of forms of oppression. When I first came out in 1972, one of the major activities of lesbian and gay organizations was to organize the biggest contingents they could in anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. You'd have open lesbian and gay contingents in demonstrations against the Vietnam War because we understood that our liberation was bound up with the liberation of other oppressed and marginalized people. We've been asked to sort of forget all of that. So when it comes to Palestine right now and the genocide that's being enacted against Palestinians, especially in Gaza, but including lots of queer, trans, and gender diverse Palestinians, the mainstream groups want us to forget about that. They don't want to say a thing about it because they get too much funding from the federal Canadian government, which of course is actively supporting those genocidal actions by the Israeli state and government. So that goes back to even the Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, that struggle that happened, just 10 or 12 years ago. It's largely been forgotten about in terms of even the history of pride organizing in Toronto. And people had to organize incredibly to prevent Quia from being banned year after year after year. I helped to organize the letter in 2010 of people who'd actually formed the Lesbian and Gay Pride Day Committee in 1981. And all of us who signed that statement actually were really clear that the anti-apartheid struggle in Palestine, just like the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, was intrinsic, was tied up with, was bound up with our liberation movements as queer and trans people. But do those provide some examples?
Yeah. So, okay, I am a basic bitch. Okay, I am as dumb as rocks. I'm also brilliant, but I'm also dumb as rocks.
I'm sure you're not dumb as rocks, but okay.
Trust me, I am, but I'm also brilliant. So it's take your pick. But the fundamentals of your thinking and your writing and your teaching, is it based in Marxism?
Certainly,
is that a fair statement to make?
Certainly, that's one source that I draw from. What I would describe more as historical materialism, a historical and a materialist approach in my analysis. But I also draw incredibly on Black liberation, Black feminist theorizing, abolitionist theorizing, liberation theorizing in a whole bunch of different contexts, including the sort of very radical developments that have come out of queer and trans and gender diverse organizing. So there's a whole bunch of different sources. So you cannot put me simply into the slot like, oh, he's a Marxist, right? That's not accurate. Certainly I use aspects of Marx's method, and I extend it and criticize Marx for actually being unable to actually support the liberation of queer and trans people. I mean, Marx was actually aware of the early homosexual rights movement in Germany, and he and Engels wrote horrible things about it. So he was unable to actually apply his critical revolutionary method to our experiences and our struggles, and instead he supported heterosexual hegemony and forms of patriarchal authority. So I'm quite critical of approaches within Marxism as well.
And on that note, we'll return after this Rainbow Country update.
Hi, I'm Keegan Hurst, former professional rugby player, coach, raving homosexual, and you're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Hitmakers is a full-service, award-winning record label and social enterprise based in Iqaluit, Nunavut. We specialize in the creating and marketing of world-class Inuit and Indigenous music, including pop, hip-hop, rock, folk, and traditional Inuit music. Hitmakers has studios in Iqaluit, Ottawa, and Toronto. The label currently works with more than 20 Inuit and Indigenous artists, and we represent and promote many more. The company was founded in 2016, and our mission is to create viable careers in the arts for Inuit and Indigenous artists through music, media, and education. Our secondary mission is to empower artists to share and strengthen their stories and culture. To learn more, please connect with us on social media or at hitmakers.com. That's Hitmakers with a Z. Thanks for listening. Koyanami.
So, as you know, Rainbow Country airs on broadcast radio, streaming, and as an edited podcast. Most of those outlets and platforms are listener supported. So if you think what I'm doing here on Rainbow Country, working to give voice to the LGBT community and beyond, is worthwhile, I hope you'll consider making a donation to this very outlet you are tuned to. If you happen to be listening to the edited podcast version, I hope you'll consider making a donation to an outlet that does carry Rainbow Country. How can you do this? Simple. Head over to marktara.com where everything is connected and hit the donation banner. That's where you'll find a list of all the outlets that carry Rainbow Country. A little gay radio show working to give voice to the LGBT community and beyond. Let your voice, let your support be heard.
Hi, I'm Jamie B. of TG CD Style Toronto, and I'm a professional feminization makeup artist and stylist providing male-to-female transformations and mentoring to those who identify as a cross-dresser or a trans woman. I first heard of Rainbow Country and Mark Tara in trying to find a radio station that specifically caters to the LGBT community, and I'm so grateful I found this station. It's crucial having a platform like Rainbow Country that welcomes all aspects of the queer community, including allies like myself and what I do. It casts a spotlight on specific needs and interests of human beings, ensuring that people from all walks of life are being validated. It's a real privilege to be able to work with cross-dressers and trans women by helping them align themselves with their feminine energy through the glorious feminization process. So, I want to thank Rainbow Country and Mark Tara for providing this platform for all of us.
Hi, my name is Joanne Vanicola, and I'm an actor and a writer, and I was first on Rainbow Country with Mark Tara on discussing the massacre at Pulse Club in Orlando. I realized how important it was for our community to have a radio station, specifically for our issues, to talk about people in the LGBTQ community and to provide an outlet for our stories, to discuss our politics, culture, and give voice to the issues that matter to us. And of course our artists and the things that we do globally and talk about culture. And without people like Mark Tara providing a space for this with a radio show like this, then we wouldn't have that voice. So support, tune in. Thank you.
Hi everyone, this is Mark Tewksbury, Olympic champion, leader, humanitarian. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
So Gary Kinsman, were you a writer? Were you a writer for The Body Politic?
I wrote a couple of articles. I was mostly involved in a sort of alternative publication called Rights for Gay and Lesbian Liberation. It was spelled RITES, Rights for Lesbian and Gay Liberation. That was a sort of more pro-feminist, somewhat more left-wing alternative to The Body Politic that existed from, let's say, 1983, 84 until the early 1990s. So I was much more involved. If you want to think about me as a writer, I was much more a writer for that type of publication. I did write for the Body Politic, and
I remember that magazine, that newspaper, like it folded out and all that sort of stuff. Getting it at Glad Day Bookshop and Jared Moldenhauer and all that sort of stuff.
Gerald Moldenhauer was one of the first people I actually went out with when I was just coming out. I'm not the second guy I ever had sex with. Right. So, I mean, I've been around for a long time. I helped to buy some of the first wood that was used at Glad Day when it was still in Kensington Market. And that's a long time ago in the early 70s. Right. So I'm a bit of what Tim McCaskill might describe as a dinosaur, but I hope I'm a dinosaur in a good sense.
And Tim has been on the show. I play him on the show regularly. Excerpts from his book. A brilliant man, as are you. So, the Lesbian and Gay Pride Day Committee of Toronto, you helped to start this. Was this an inspiration for, or the beginning of Pride Toronto that happened in 81?
Pride Toronto claims that, but I think we actually were something rather different. The Lesbian and Gay Pride Day Committee in Toronto in 1981 was initiated by Gay Liberation Against the Right Everywhere. We were actually red baited by some of the gay businesses and MCC people who didn't want to have anything to do with us. It was actually, we developed a coalition with Lesbians Against the Right and with the Right to Privacy Committee that actually helped us to become a very significant organization. We had probably 1,500 people at the festival in Grange Park that year, and about 1,000 people went on the march. And we did stop outside 52 Division, and we did chant things like Chris Birchall's slogan, "No more shit," and we chanted "Fuck you 52," which
this was in regards to the bathhouse raids.
52 Division was the sort of lead police organizing division of the bath raids. So, yeah,
Operation Soap.
Those were very popular slogans, both at the demonstrations against the bath raids of thousands of people, but also on Pride Day. I mean, Pride Day in 1981 was not simply just a celebration of pride. It was also resistance to police repression. So, yeah, I was one of the founding members of the committee. And it was only by 1986, 1987 that corporate sponsorship started to be entered into what became Pride Toronto, and the transformation of Pride Toronto into being a much more corporate defined and much more commercialized and state identified institution did not really take place until the early 1990s. It was initially a community-based organization that was not incorporated, that did not have an executive director, did not have a board of directors. It was a community-based group.
You've been around and been instrumental in regards to, queer liberation. How, in 2024, generally speaking, how do you see the evolution of the LGBT community? How do you see things going? Do you see things fracturing at some point in the future between, the more like lesbian and gay, the more sexual aspect, as opposed to the gender aspect of things? How are you seeing the evolution of the LGBT community, especially moving forward?
Yes. So, there's been major gains made, right? When I came out in the early 1970s, I didn't quite anticipate or believe that the types of transformations that have taken place would take place. But it's also important to recognize where those transformations came from. They did not come from on high, from politicians, granting us things. They came from our struggles and our mass organizing. Like the Right to Privacy Committee, through its mass organizing, actually won the acquittal for most of the men who were charged. It helped to create the basis for getting rid of some of the repressive criminal code legislation that they've used against us. So first of all, I would just want to say we've made remarkable progress, but it's largely been because of the way in which we organized and the allies that we won. We need to remember that we had important allies in the Black community, in the feminist community. Of course, our movements overlap with those groups to even begin with, so that we've made remarkable progress. But the problem now is that the progress we've made, ironically, has produced a whole set of problems and obstacles. So there now is this layer of people who think that all we need to do is to be accepted as white, middle-class, gay and lesbian people. And that's not going to include most of us, right? I mean, Black, Indigenous, racialized people, poor people, sex workers are not going to be accepted in that framework. And then, of course, you even have some groups, and it's not as pronounced here in the Canadian state as it is in England and the United States, who want to entirely expel trans people from our communities. That needs to be absolutely opposed. Trans people have always been part of our organizing and communities, and it's really crucial that we recognize that the attacks on trans people that are currently going on are attacks on all of us, and also that one of the reasons why those attacks are taking place is that trans and gender diverse people have actually made remarkable transformations in their lives and have profoundly threatened the right wing in our society. And it's really important for us to develop really significant coalitions in support of them. And some people think the police are somehow going to defend us, queers and trans people. But if you actually look at all of the instances that have gone on, and I've been involved in some of them, and I certainly know about some of them, the police are almost always on the other side. They're almost always trying to criminalize us and brutalize us. There's lots of examples of that I could go into. I mean, even at the Fort York Public Library last year, when I was part of the sort of queer, trans, anti-fascist group that was defending the people at the Drag Story Hour, well, it probably was more than an hour, but who were defending those people from Save Canada and other quite racist, if not fascist organizations who want to get rid of queer and trans people. We defended those people at the Fort York Public Library. It was not the police. The police actually at the end allowed the fascists to actually attack us as we were trying to leave. So, and then in Ottawa, similar things have happened when Joel Harden got pushed and shoved by a number of the fascist Save Canada people who are incredibly anti-trans. When people came to Joel Harden's defense and stepped into the street as part of doing that, they were arrested by the police. And that was queer and trans people were arrested by the police for trying to defend a NDP MPP from attack. So those are just some examples. So we've made remarkable progress, but we've also, ironically, through that progress, produced a whole set of new obstacles. So what we need to do is to remember our history and make all of those connections again that have been lost. And it seems to me that that's what's most optimistic. I've seen incredible things happen lately. I've seen, when I was in Halifax, I helped to organize with the young queer and trans people who were organizing against the right wing. And there were 1,500 of them there, and in response to 800 or 1,000 of the right wing and fascist people. And those young people are our future. And we need to nurture that and to develop it. And they need to connect with the radical histories that they're part of.
Gary Kinsman, here's my last question for you, and it's simply this: what do you hope your audience comes away with after they've read the third edition of Regulation of Desire, Queer Histories, Queer Struggles?
Yeah.
What do you hope your audience takes away from the third edition?
Well, I think they'll come away with a lot, and I think there's sort of two different audiences. There's the audience that actually did read the second edition or is familiar with it, that I think will focus more on the new material that's in the book in terms of the new introduction, the rewriting of Chapter 4 on Indigenous People and Struggles, and the last two chapters. So there'll be people who will get a lot from just noticing the stuff that was in the second edition. I've had people come up to me and say, I've never seen a historical account of how sexual regulation took place in Canada before, in so-called Canada before. So, I mean, I'm impressed that people can actually still come away with that. But I'm especially convinced and impressed by the people who have read the second edition before, who are now looking at the new material and finding it incredibly useful and helpful for them in their struggles today. Because it's not an academic book, it's actually an activist book. So what I would hope most comes out of it is more organizing, more radical activism. I really hope that that's what can come out of the book in a major way. And it's got multiple uses. Some people might use it as a doorstop. Some people might actually use it to throw against people trying to attack them, including the police. And obviously, it's also an important book to be read. But it does have multi-purposes as well. And that's one good thing about a really big book, that it can actually be used for a number of different reasons. But I'm partially being sarcastic there. But I do think that people are already finding that the book is incredibly helpful. I mean, even if you only wanted to read it for understanding what's happened since 1996, you read the last 2 chapters and you'll have a really good grasp of what's taken place since 1996. So one of my major achievements in the book, and I think that's pretty clear, is that I've actually been able to provide a way for people to grasp what has taken place since 1996.
Gary Kinsman, well said, well done, well written. Thanks for your time. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
The Regulation of Desire, Core Histories, Core Struggles, is out now wherever you get your favorite books, including Amazon.ca.
Bill 7, to ban discrimination in employment, government services, and housing, based on a person's sexual orientation, was up for a vote at Queen's Park. Most NDP and Liberal MPPs supported the bill, but without some progressive Conservative legislators backing, a divisive split could rack the province. 4 PCs decided to break party ranks to vote with their conscience and support Bill 7. Cabinet Minister and MPP Dennis Timbrell did it to show solidarity for his beloved brother, the well-known drag queen Rusty Ryan. And for me, a gay politician who was not yet out, I had to take a stand. We were known as the Gang of Four. I'm former Cabinet Minister and MPP Phil Gillies. The date, December 2nd, 1986, when LGBT rights came to Ontario.
And just like that, this little gay journey through Rainbow Country has come to an end. For the full 2-hour episode, simply head over to marktara.com, where everything is connected, and hit the archives banner. To keep up to date with the show, check out my socials at Mark Tara. The podcast is available on all major platforms. And finally, I want to take this time to thank you for taking your time to be with me. Remember, we are living in days of making dreams come true, so believe in yourself, and the world will believe in you.
Hi, this is Michael Anthony Alago, music executive, photographer, author, and you are listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.